Okay. A Journey Through Addiction. The story Beautiful Boy is about a father's journey trying to help his addict son get clean and better himself. David is struggling with trying to convince his son Nick not to use drugs. While David is going through these changes with Nick, he doesn't notice that he is causing himself to produce an addiction. Sheaf's addiction is towards his son Nick. He is so consumed with Nick's life that he is losing track of what's important: his wife, other children, and his own physical and mental well-being. Nick and David both are going through a lot of changes due to these addictions, causing them both to suffer in many ways. Nick has the type of addiction that you can physically see. By just looking at Nick, you can tell physically he has a serious problem. His addiction is methamphetamine, marijuana, and some pills. When Nick doesn't have these drugs, his body goes through withdrawal, causing him to need the drugs to be able to cope. In the text, Sheaf says, how can both Nick's, the loving and considerate and generous one, and the self-obsessed and self-destructive one be the same person? Sheaf 96. Those drugs made Nick like he was two different people when he was high and when he wasn't. David was lost. He just couldn't fathom the fact that his perfect son is an addict. Meanwhile, David is suffering from his addiction, which is towards his son. Trying to help Nick is taking over his mind and thoughts. Sheaf is wrapped up with his son. He can't focus on his family or himself. Sheaf states, I stare into the dark, my anxiety mounting. It is a pathologically familiar state. I have been waiting for Nick for years. Sheaf 7. David has to start living his own life because his addiction to Nick can be very deadly. People who are always constantly involved with someone who has an addiction usually tends to grow an addiction as well. They're constantly around that person, trying to help and make sure they are okay, and start to forget about themselves and their own well-being. Sheaf admits in one section, caring about an addict is as complex and fraught and deliberating as an addiction itself. Sheaf 13. She finally notices that he too has developed a problem, his addiction to Nick. His thoughts and everything are evolved around Nick, and it's hard for Sheaf to think or focus on anything with his son in the shape of with this. Sorry. It is hard for Sheaf to think or focus on anything with his son in the shape he is in. Chef always second guess himself. I began to second guess each of my past decisions, including our move to the country. Sheaf 58. David is like any caring parent. When you're always a part of your child's life, you can't just give up on them no matter what the problem is. It takes time to gradually try to drift away from your child when they're doing wrong. Being a good parent without letting the world know the tragedy, David tries numerous ways to help his son Nick from his addictive behaviors. This was the beginning of a journey through a father's addiction to helping his son through his addiction. I truly believe that David does have an unhealthy addiction to his son getting better. Chef admits to his son that he was addicted to drugs for a period of time when he was in college. I try to convince him that I know what I'm talking about, that I understand the ubiquity and the persistent pressure to do drugs, that I understand their seductiveness. Sheaf's 59. He believes that he can relate to his son because of his prior addiction in college. As the story goes on, David compares his experiences with Nick, hoping it will steer him clear from doing drugs. David's addiction leads him to try to learn more about the meaning of addiction and the effects it has on Nick. Going on, David shows his own role in the addiction process, accepting verification from others outside his family that's trying to lend help. Chef, Chef states, finally someone has said it. So it is my fault that Nick has become increasingly sullen and shadowy and taking drugs, and it is now lying and stealing. I was too lenient. I am ready to bear this judgment, to accept that I have blown it. Chef 93. This is where David admits his guilt and his role in the addiction. There are some differences in the addiction of Nick and his father, which include how they seek help, how the addict look at those trying to help them, and the lasting effects. In David's situation, it shows that writing the story was therapeutic, and now the situation is exposed worldwide. There is a relief knowing that he may be helping others. Doing this has helped Sheaf with his own addiction. As for Nick to get help with his addiction, he has to first realize that there is a problem that has to be addressed in order for him to get the effective treatment. There is no evidence that shows a concern during his times of addiction or relapse. Because of their addictions, David and Nick has created something that will forever stick with them. Similarities between the addictions of David and Nick include the desire to learn what an addiction is, how it influences relationships, and much more. Nick is learning about his addiction while he is actually experiencing the process of it. David acknowledges how other family members have been affected. He states, "I rage against his struggle and pain and how his addiction has caused so much pain in our lives. Ours, his, and I am also filled with boundless love for him." Chef 272. This shows both Chef's personal relationships and his family's. This addiction that both Nick and David have is a personal choice. It was made voluntarily and can only be cured by themselves when they choose to do so. David talks about his relationship with Nick throughout the story. It's clear David is overwhelmed with the treatment of his son's addiction. Chef admits another figure hangs somewhat precautiously between them. Me. I am the enabler, propping Nick up, making excuses for him, bending over backwards to care for him, trying to protect Karen, Jasper, and Daisy from him, and yet also trying to keep them all connected to another. Chef 152. Throughout the story, it appears that Nick and David's life to addiction were completely different. David has become addicted to treating and finding out why this has happened to his family. Thanks to David's courage to tell his story that was so secretive and also embarrassing for him has helped more people come out and seek help for their addiction and seeking treatment as well. David was very strong for sharing his personal family addictions to the world. Thank you.